Hi guys! Welcome back for your second flipped video. Today we are going to be talking about how does a historian work, okay? And it matters because knowing how historians work help us to understand historical information. So make sure you have your notes ready. Don't forget you can pause and rewind at any time to make sure you have what you need. So let's get started.
Oh, hello Wildcats. This is Mr. Green. I am here to talk to you about evidence because the question for section 2 is how does a historian work? So whenever a historian is piecing together a story, because that's what historians do, they piece together a story, they learn about the story of whatever the subject is. So how do they get that story together? How do they put the pieces together? It's because they have evidence. They find evidence through many different ways, like primary or secondary sources. You'll find out about that in just a minute. They use artifacts, they use fossils, they use written documents, interviews, or so forth. This is called evidence. Evidence, as you see on your slide, is something that shows proof or an indication that something is true. Or indication that something is true. Historians could use evidence in forms of material objects, such as artifacts and fossils, or evidence may appear in documents or written materials that were created during a historical event. This is all about evidence. You got to have evidence if you're going to make a claim. Now, historians, that is their goal when they're writing these textbooks. These textbooks are not written just based on what they think happened. It's written based on what they have evidence happened. So evidence is very important to historians who are trying to make sure they make their most accurate information available as possible. All right, thank you very much, guys. Now your next slide will be about primary and secondary sources, what those are. Thank you.
So, as you may remember, we talked about fossils and artifacts in the last video as tools that historians use to find and learn about history. So, all of those tools can be categorized into two different kinds of sources. Our first is called a primary source. This is an account of an event created by someone who witnessed or took part in it. Now, if you look on your screen, you can see that I have several examples of what a primary source might look like. So for example, here you can see a handwritten letter, okay? And then at the bottom, you might see a journal of an event. Here is also an example of a fossil. And then videos such as YouTube, things that you watch, those are also primary sources. And then down here we have a first-hand picture. So the person taking the photo, the photographer, is considered a primary source. Then we also have maps and newspapers that account as primary sources. So the second type of source that we have is known as a secondary source. Now this is information gathered by someone who did not take part in or witness the actual event. So for example, here we have a textbook. Now, this textbook was written by people who didn't actually partake in the event, but they gathered their information from someone who did, such as historians that may have had experience in that or witnessed an event. Okay, same with Exploring History magazine down here. The title of that says Young Lincoln. They obviously didn't experience Young Lincoln, so that would be considered a secondary source. Same as the encyclopedia. Now, if you're looking at your notes, you see that there are boxes for you to draw examples or non-examples like the last set of notes, okay? So I want you to come to a pause and I want you to draw examples of a secondary source and then a non-example or what is not considered a secondary source, and then as well as giving me something that is not a primary source. So just give me a drawing or a list of an example of what it is not for the non-examples. So go ahead and pause the video, take your time, and then come back to learn about reliability.
All right, now that Ms. Lewis has told you about the different kinds of sources, we need to ask some questions about these sources. Are these primary and secondary sources good sources? Are they quality sources? So we have some questions we need to ask. And one of the first questions we need to ask is it reliable? Where was this person when they wrote this? Why did they write it? Why did they create it? And when was it created? And then we can ask another question about it. We can ask, what is the point of view of the person who wrote this source or created this source? We want to know, what was the author thinking? What does he think about life? What does he think about this event? Is he biased? Is this author predispositioned, meaning he thinks ahead, thinks before the event gets here, how he feels about that event? So we have two questions. Is it reliable? And what is this person's point of view? So those are the questions we want to ask about our secondary and our primary resources. Are these sources that we're looking at, do they fit into a category of where we're able to use them? Are they quality information? And so then it brings us to another question. Is the person who wrote this, are they biased? And by bias, we're saying they have an unreasonable emotional judgment about the people and the events that these sources are about on the topic of the source. For instance, I'm an Alabama fan, and I like to watch Alabama football. So when I watch a football game and I look at a game, and if a team loses 21-0, and I ask them, I say, hey, how was the game? And the person says to me, oh, was it great? It was okay, but my team, the referees were against us. There was a lot of cheating going on by the other team. They were unfair. We just couldn't catch a break. Everything went the other team's way. Listen, come on. This person is biased toward their team because their team just lost 21-0. They just got beat. Now, it's okay to love your team and support your team and be proud to have your team, but you need to say, hey, we just got beat. The other team was better than us. Don't give excuses about it. Just say, hey, we just got beat. And that's being a valid source, a good source, a source that sees it clearly, not just the way we want it to be. We see things just exactly as they are. And when you're being biased, you don't see things the way they are. You see things the way you are and the way you want them to be. So that may not be a good source if a person is too biased one way or the other. So we have primary and secondary resources, and then we need to decide, is this a quality source? Is this source one we can use to make judgments about other events, or is it just a person's opinion and it's not one we should use and not one we should consider when we're looking at history? All right, guys, well, I will talk to you later.
Now that we know about the sources that historians use and some of the questions they ask about those sources, let's take a look at what historians do when they start putting them together. There's a process that people use to write about history, and so that's what our next section of our notes is going to be about. After historians have gathered their evidence, the first step that they need to take is to make inferences about that evidence. We use information from both primary and secondary sources, whether those are fossils, artifacts, or anything else, to put the picture together and choose the most likely interpretation of what happened. So we kind of like a crime scene investigator, we gather all the evidence, put it together, and try to create a story out of what those clues tell us happened. Then we start to look at history and record it a little bit more. So after we've gathered that information and written about it, we publish it in a scholarly journal or magazine. That means one that's concerned with learning or research. And those articles are usually reviewed by other scholars or historians to make sure that the information is accurate and fits in with what the evidence is telling us, so we don't get any crazy theories that the evidence doesn't support. Then we start to focus their research a little bit more. Now, some historians like to keep their focus very narrow. They might focus on just one event or time period throughout history. For example, I know historians who just study ancient Mesopotamia, or some who even just study Pompeii in ancient Rome, while others keep their focus on much broader subjects like the ancient world or the history of a particular country. In world history, we take a much broader version throughout all the different countries that we learn about. After a historical event has been researched, analyzed, and historians have made inferences, it's important to be able to draw conclusions. A conclusion is a final decision that's reached by reasoning. Historians look for facts and evidence from lots of different sources, whether it's primary sources, secondary sources, fossils, artifacts, anything we can find. and the more the better. And then we fit all of those puzzle pieces together to draw a conclusion or make a judgment. It's always good in history, just like we have, to have a big question that we're trying to answer so that we can solve this problem. But the problem is that historians don't always agree on what those interpretations are. Sometimes we disagree about what the different facts and clues mean. However, just like Ms. Hodges was talking about, when we recognize that bias, we can evaluate both sides and evaluate all the sources and explain why both interpretations can be argued. I love this comic here because this points this out. Depending on your point of view, it might look like there are 3 blocks that these figures are looking at, or it might look like 4. And this is why the more evidence we have, the better off we are as historians, because we'll have more clues to help us put the puzzle piece together.
Hello, Wildcats. Welcome back. This is Mr. Green, and I am going to talk to you about page 13. There's one more thing we need to do, just one more thing. Now, if you turn to the bottom of that page, page 13, you'll see that there is a hot question. The hot question says, please explain why some historians differ in their interpretations of historical events. So, not all historians agree on everything. Why do you think some of their interpretations, some of what they believe, might be different from their colleagues, might be different from other historians? Why? And there is a question mark at the end of that. Think about it. I think that's the tune. Is that the tune? I think it is. All right. Anyways, answer that question. I'll see you later. Have a great day, Wildcats. Bye.